Hi, this is Danielle Pierce, and I'm going to be doing my project on Nat Drug. There are so many people in our country suffering from drug addiction. According to a survey completed in 2013, 9.4% of our population in the United States 12 and older have used some sort of illicit drug. Many people who begin using drugs also tend to get addicted to them, which causes a lot more problems for our country. While there are many different types of help for drug abusers, such as NA, AA, rehabilitation centers, and detox units, this costs our country approximately $180 billion each year. Each year, however, it seems that the drug costs are increasing about 5% and climbing since 1992. With the trends of drug addiction and rehabilitation increasing, our country's income is decreasing. With the cost rising for drug addiction and rehabilitation, this makes citizens question the cost of treatment for drug addicts. Drug addiction costs the country money from rehabilitation programs, incarceration, child and family services, welfare agencies, and many other various resources that are used for people who have drug addiction problems. When Americans look at the rising trends of drug addictions, they often view the cost and how it is going to negatively affect the country. The GSS survey came into play asking questions to American citizens about the cost effects of drug addiction and rehabilitation to see what Americans were truly feeling. The purpose of the study is to analyze the data from the GSS to determine if Americans feel too much, too little, or just enough is being spent on drug addiction. The General Social Survey is a national survey that includes the responses of 2,044 adult Americans selected as a representative sample. The representative sample means that the data collected by these individuals is representative of the American population of adults 18 years old and older. Although there is always the possibility of sampling error, the sampling error in this data set is plus or minus only a few percentage points. Data from the survey began collection in 1972 and has collected data on more than 5,000 topics since. The GSS were collected in face-to-face household interviews. The data for the research comes from the 2006 GSS dataset. We are faced with many problems in this country, none of which can be easily solved or inexpensively. I'm going to name some of these problems, and for each one, I'd like you to name some of these problems. And for each one, I'd like you to tell me whether you think we're spending too much, too little, or just about the right amount on drug addiction and rehabilitation. Do you believe we are spending too much on drug addiction and rehabilitation in this country? Or do you feel we are spending too little on drug addiction and rehabilitation in this country? Here's the table of the three categories: too little, about right, or too much of the amount spent on drug addiction and rehabilitation in America. The histogram below shows the data on the variable preference towards drug addiction and rehabilitation. A histogram is a form of displaying data graphically and is particularly useful when displaying data with a relatively large number of categories. The datagram in the histograms graphically presents the information about the variable. On the left-hand side is dealing with drug addiction, and on the right-hand side is the respondent's gender. A frequency distribution is a numeric display of the number of times and relative percentage of each time of a variable occurs in a given sample. Below is the frequency table for the Nat Drug. From the table, I can determine about people think too much, just right, or people feel our country is spending too little. A cross-tabulation is a matrix that shows the distribution of one variable for each category variable. Crosstabs offer the researcher a snapshot of possible correlations between two variables of interest. In this case, for instance, is gender related to or associated with preference towards how much our country is spending on drug addiction? The crosstabs suggest that women are a little more likely than men to feel we are spending too little or about right on drug addiction, but knowing the respondent's gender does not help us enough in determining whether they think how much is the right amount to spend on drug addiction. Research question: do males think our country is spending too much on drug rehabilitation and addiction programs? Hypothesis 1. One's gender is linked to how much money they feel our country is spending on drug addiction. Hypothesis 2. One's gender is not linked to how much money they feel our country is spending on drug addiction. My independent variable is gender, and the dependent variable is dealing with drug addiction. Correlation refers to a relationship between two or more variables. Correlational studies search for relationships but cannot prove that one variable causes a change in another variable. In other words, correlation does not equal causation. Researchers use the correlation coefficient as a measure of correlational strength. This number can range between -1 to +1. Gamma is a test to measure the strength of association between ordinal variables, or in this case, where there is a mixture of nominal and ordinal variables. In this study, one's gender is nominal, but the preference to Nat Drug is ordinal. As such, gamma was used to determine the correlation strength here. The gamma measure is -0.77 or 7% and has been identified as a negative and uninteresting. When dealing with drug addiction, there is a 1% chance that the respondent's sex will influence their answers on whether or not someone is spending too much or too little on drug rehabilitation, which is very insignificant. However, when looking at the symmetric measures, we would be able to guess someone's gender and be right 7% of the time, which is still a weak relationship. Because the relationship between one's gender and their preference to how much is spent on drug addiction was determined to be weak and uninteresting, based on the gamma measure, race will be investigated. I ran the same test but replaced sex with race. Results focusing on race as an independent variable showed a stronger relationship. The gamma measure determined that the relationship between one's race and their preference for Nat Drug was 18%. This is evidence of a strong association and extremely interesting. This can also be interpreted as, if I were to try to attempt to guess one's preference for too much, too little, or just right, I would be 18% more likely to guess right by relying on one's race. As such, the research hypothesis for the test of significance will be rewritten as follows. Hypothesis 1. A person's race will influence their preference towards money spent on drug addiction. Hypothesis 2. A person's race will not influence their preference towards money spent on drug addiction. My independent variable is race. My dependent variable is dealing with drug addiction. Hypothesis testing is an efficient approach using systematic procedures to determine whether the results of a study support the hypothesis of a research. Researchers determine their hypotheses with their population in mind. There are 5 steps to hypothesis testing. 1. Restate the question. 2. Determine the characteristics. 3. Determine the cutoff sample. 4. Determine your sample score. And 5. Decide whether to reject the null hypothesis or accept it. The next thing I did was a t-test, which is a significant test based on means. The t-test examines the distribution of values for one variable among different groups. To determine the relationship using a t-test, one must use the 5 steps of hypothesis testing when examining the results. The steps for this are the same 5 steps of hypothesis testing. Research question. Does race have any influence on whether or not people feel we as a country are spending too much, too little, or just enough on drug addiction? Research hypothesis. Race does influence whether or not people believe we are spending too much, too little, or not enough on drug addiction. Null hypothesis. Race does not influence whether or not people believe we are spending too much, too little, or not enough on drug addiction. The level of significance is set to 95%, and the sig two-tailed is at 0.000. So we will be rejecting the null hypothesis and supporting the research hypothesis. However, the t-test is not an appropriate test to run for the variables, so I will be running a chi-square. The chi-square is a test of significance which is usually used for ordinal variables, 2 nominal variables, and sometimes a mix between the 2. This test is one of the most widely used and estimates the probability that the association between variables is a result of random chance or sampling error by comparing their actual or observed distribution of responses with the distribution of responses we would expect if there were absolutely no association between two variables. The reason I use this test instead of the ANOVA test is because it makes more sense to run the chi-square test for my variables. Race and dealing with drug addiction. The results for this test conclude that we can reject the null hypothesis and support our research hypothesis because the cutoff is less than 0.5%. The media portrays drug rehabilitation and drug addiction in a different light than what it should be viewed as. There was a study done by the General Social Survey asking people how much time they spent watching, reading, or listening to the media. Then, after they got this information, they used it to determine how many of these people had answered whether or not our country is spending too much, too little, or just enough on drug addiction in this country. The GSS determined that the media does, in fact, play a big role in how people answer this question. Their hypothesis was that the more people have exposure to the media, they felt that too little was being spent on drug addiction and rehabilitation. After researching this, they proved their hypothesis as correct and that the media did influence people's decisions. The second article I researched was about the family functioning in people who are currently in rehabilitation programs for addiction. This study done in Malaysia interprets family functioning, cognitive function, and resilience to determine what people have a higher success rate of completing. This study uses family functioning in terms of how much family support people have during their treatment, determines their success rates for completion. The study shows that the more family interactions people have, the higher the resilience is of completing drug rehabilitation programs and staying clean. The cognitive function analyzes different disorders classified on the DSM that could influence their abilities to stay clean and on track. Disorders include, but are not limited to, bipolar, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, and other various disorders classified on the DSM. Treatment for these disorders is imperative for someone to continue on the right path. If these disorders are not treated, the resilience level of completion has a low rate of success, versus people who undergo treatment for these disorders have a higher success rate. In conclusion, based on the statistical analysis of the data found in the General Social Survey, there is a relationship between one's race and their preference to how much money is spent on drug addiction. Researchers can use this data to run more tests and surveys to see the effect drug addiction has on our country. Perhaps follow-up research can focus on the study on how media influences people's decision on whether they feel too much, too little, or not enough money is spent on drug addiction. In our country moving forward, researchers can also focus on the level of family functioning one has that has an influence on whether or not someone completes rehabilitation and beats drug addiction the first time versus relapsing and starting the process all over again. Thank you for watching and listening to my presentation. It was nice having class with you guys for 8 weeks, and I wish you the best of luck. Bye.